The air smelled of sun-baked asphalt and the faint sweetness of blooming linden trees lining the sidewalk. Quincy Walker, a 25-year-old programmer from Brooklyn, was walking home from a local coffee shop, clutching a paper cup of iced coffee. His sneakers tapped softly against the pavement, and his earbuds pulsed with the rhythm of a jazz track. Quincy loved this route. Narrow streets, old brick buildings, the hum of pedestrians, and the honking of taxis created an atmosphere that made him feel part of something bigger. But today, something felt off. He noticed a group of men ahead, 3 white guys around 30, standing by a parked pickup truck. Their voices were loud, their laughter sharp, like the sound of breaking glass. One of them, wearing a red cap, turned and looked at Quincy. His gaze wasn't just curious, it was hostile. Quincy instinctively gripped his coffee cup tighter, but kept walking, holding his head high. He knew that look. He'd known it since childhood, when his family moved to a mostly white neighborhood on the city's outskirts. "Hey, you!" the man in the red cap called out, pushing off the truck. His voice cut through the air like a knife. "Where you hurrying off to?" Quincy stopped. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to breathe evenly. He removed his earbuds, turned slowly toward the men, and asked calmly, "Something you need?" The other 2, a guy with a tattoo on his neck and another in a faded t-shirt, exchanged glances and snickered. The man in the red cap stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Just wondering what you're doing around here," he said, emphasizing here, as if Quincy were an outsider in his own neighborhood. "This ain't your place, is it?" The air thickened, like the moment before a storm. Quincy felt heat rising to his face, but instead of snapping back, he forced a smile, not defiant, but restrained, almost weary. "I live 2 blocks from here," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Heading home. That a problem?" The man in the cap snorted, as if Quincy had just told a bad joke. His friends stepped closer, forming a loose semicircle. Passers-by either looked away or quickened their pace. An elderly woman with a grocery bag paused briefly, but, sensing the tension, hurried off. "Problem is, people like you think you can just walk wherever you want," said the man with the tattoo, his voice low and menacing. "This is our neighborhood." Quincy felt something heavy tighten in his chest. He knew these words weren't just an insult. They were part of something bigger, older, seeping into the city's life, like cracks in the pavement. But he also knew that responding with anger would only make things worse. He took a deep breath, smelling coffee mixed with exhaust fumes, and said, "Look, I don't want trouble. I'm just going home. Let's all walk away, all right?" His words hung in the air. For a moment, it seemed the tension might dissipate. But the man in the red cap took another step forward, his face twisting into a sneer. "Don't tell me what to do," he growled, shoving Quincy in the chest. The coffee cup fell, splashing a dark stain across the sidewalk. Quincy stumbled back, struggling to keep his balance. His hands instinctively clenched into fists, but he forced them to relax. At that moment, a familiar voice called out from behind. "Hey, what's going on here?" It was Trevor, his neighbor, a tall black man in his 40s who worked as a security guard at the local supermarket. Trevor was walking with 2 friends, both black, and their presence instantly shifted the dynamic. The man in the red cap stepped back, but his eyes burned with anger. "This ain't your business," he snapped at Trevor. "When I see someone messing with my friend, it becomes my business," Trevor replied, his voice calm but laced with steel. He stepped between Quincy and the group, his broad shoulders forming a barrier. The situation was escalating. Someone in the crowd pulled out a phone, likely to record. Quincy felt the air grow heavy with tension. He knew one careless move could ignite everything. He placed a hand on Trevor's shoulder and said softly, Trevor, don't. Let's just go. But the man in the red cap wasn't done. He spat on the ground in front of Quincy and sneered, "You're lucky your buddies are here. But we'll meet again." Trevor took a step forward, his fists clenching, but Quincy tightened his grip on his shoulder. "He's not worth it," Quincy said, his voice low but firm. "Let's go." Trevor glanced at him, his eyes blazing, but he nodded. They turned and walked away, leaving the group behind. Quincy could hear them shouting something after them, but the words dissolved into the city's hum. When they were a safe distance away, Trevor stopped and turned to Quincy. "Why didn't you teach them a lesson?" he asked, his voice a mix of frustration and concern. "You know guys like that won't back off." Quincy sighed, staring at the sidewalk where the coffee stains still lingered. "Because a fight won't change anything," he said. "They just get the excuse they want to say we're what they think we are." Trevor shook his head, but a flicker of respect crossed his eyes. "You're either real smart or real naive," he said. Quincy gave a faint smile. "Maybe a bit of both." They walked on, but Quincy couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. He heard a growing noise behind them. Loud voices, footsteps, snatches of curses. He glanced back and saw the group from the pickup following, now joined by two more. Across the street, two young black guys, likely witnesses to the earlier conflict, started shouting back. The air was turning explosive. Quincy stopped. His heart raced, but he knew if he didn't act now, it could end in blood. He turned to Trevor and said quietly, "Help me stop this." Not with fists, with words. Trevor looked at him like he was crazy, but Quincy was already stepping toward the approaching crowd. His hands trembled, but his voice stayed calm. "Wait," he called out, raising his hands. "Let's talk." The man in the red cap laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. "Talk," he said. "You serious?" "Yeah," Quincy replied, his gaze steady. "If you've got something to say it to me. But let's do it without fists." The crowd froze. All eyes were on Quincy, some skeptical, others curious. In that moment, he felt he was holding something fragile but immensely important, and he knew his next words would determine whether it shattered or became the start of something else. The July air buzzed with tension, like the prelude to a thunderstorm about to tear the sky apart. Quincy stood in the middle of the sidewalk, hands raised in a gesture of calm, but his heart pounded as if it wanted to break free from his chest. Around him, a crowd was gathering. The three men from the pickup, now joined by two more, shouted insults, while across the street, two young black guys, accidental witnesses to the conflict, responded just as sharply. Trevor stood beside Quincy, shoulders tense, eyes tracking every move of the man in the red cap and his crew. The smell of spilled coffee still lingered, mingling with exhaust fumes and the faint stench of garbage from a nearby dumpster. The sounds of the city honks, the hum of air conditioners, distant sirens, formed a backdrop that only heightened the sense of chaos. Passers-by slowed their steps. Some pulled out phones to record. An elderly man in a straw hat stopped at the corner, clutching a newspaper, watching the scene with worry. "You some kind of preacher?" the man in the red cap mocked, his voice slicing through the air. "Think your words are going to change anything?" Quincy felt anger rising in his throat, but he forced himself to take a deep breath, feeling the hot air fill his lungs. He knew a single wrong move, a single careless word, could set everything ablaze. But he also believed there was another way, even if it seemed impossible. "I'm no preacher," Quincy said, his voice quiet but firm as stone. "I'm just a guy trying to get home. And I think you don't want trouble either." "Right." The man with an ink tattoo on his neck, standing next to the red cap, laughed. But it was a nervous laugh, as if he wasn't sure where this was going. "You hear that, Randy?" he said, addressing the man in the cap. "He thinks we're just gonna talk and walk away." Randy, the man in the red cap, stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. He was taller than Quincy, with broad shoulders and calloused hands that spoke of years of physical work. His stance screamed readiness for a fight, but Quincy noticed something else in his gaze, uncertainty, as if he didn't quite know why he wanted this conflict so badly. "You think you can just walk our streets?" Randy said, his voice quieter but more dangerous. "You're not one of us." The words hit Quincy like a slap, but he didn't look away. He'd heard them before, not once, not twice, but dozens of times in his life. But this time, he chose not to stay silent or respond with anger. "I was born in this city," Quincy said, his voice steady, but now carrying a strength that made Randy pause for a moment. "My mom worked as a nurse in the hospital 3 blocks from here to put me through school. My grandpa built the roads you drive on. If that doesn't make me one of you, then what does?" Silence settled over the sidewalk. Even the younger guys, shouting insults from the other side, fell quiet, as if Quincy's words had struck something in their hearts. Trevor, still standing ready, glanced at Quincy with surprise, his eyebrows slightly raised. Randy blinked, as if searching for a response, but his tattooed friend, apparently named Kyle, didn't give him the chance. "Why you even listening to him?" Kyle snapped, shoving Randy's shoulder. "He's just a talker." That move was the spark. One of the young black guys, a lanky kid in a basketball jersey, couldn't hold back and lunged forward, his fist already clenched. "Listen here, tattoo!" he shouted, but Trevor intercepted him instantly, grabbing his shoulders firmly. "Easy, Kevin," Trevor boomed, his voice like thunder. "Don't give them what they want." Quincy felt time slow down. He saw Kyle step toward Kevin, Randy hesitate, and the crowd around them start to murmur like a swarm of bees. He knew he had only seconds to stop it. "Stop!" Quincy shouted, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. He stepped forward, positioning himself between the two groups, hands raised again. "You all want to fight? Fine, but first tell me, for what? To prove who's tougher? To get your names in the news tomorrow? Or so your moms can cry when you're hauled off in handcuffs?" His words hit like a cold shower. Kevin, still held by Trevor, lowered his fist, his chest heaving with anger, but he didn't move. Kyle stopped, his eyes burning with fury, but he didn't dare take another step. Randy stood still, his gaze darting between Quincy and the crowd. "You don't know what it's like to live here," Randy said finally, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "You don't know what it's like when everything changes, when your place gets taken." Quincy felt something tighten in his chest. He heard not just anger in Randy's words, but fear hidden behind bravado. Instead of responding sharply, he nodded. "I know what it's like to feel like the world's against you," Quincy said. "I've been told I don't belong here since I was a kid. But you know what? We're all here, in this city, together. And if we fight each other, we're only helping those who want us to stay divided." Randy was silent, his jaw clenched, but he didn't look away. Quincy sensed this moment was fragile, like thin glass. One wrong move, and it would shatter. At that moment, an elderly woman stepped out from the crowd, the same one who had hurried away earlier with her grocery bag. Her gray hair was tied in a neat bun, and her eyes held a mix of fear and resolve. She stopped beside Quincy and turned to Randy. "I know you, Randy Thompson," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Your mama went to church with me, and I know she didn't raise you to pick on folks in the street." Randy blinked, his face flushing. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words caught in his throat. The woman turned to Quincy. "And you, young man, you've got a good heart," she said. "But be careful. Not everyone listens to words." She looked at the crowd, her gaze heavy as stone, and people began to disperse. Kyle muttered something under his breath and walked back to the pickup, followed by the others. Kevin and his friend also backed off, throwing angry glances at Randy. Randy stood alone, his hands hanging limply. Quincy felt the tension slowly ebb, but he knew this wasn't the end. He looked at Randy and said quietly, "If you ever want to talk, I live 2 blocks from here. Doors open." Randy didn't respond, but his gaze lingered on Quincy a moment longer than necessary. Then he turned and walked to the pickup, where his friends waited. Trevor placed a hand on Quincy's shoulder. "You're either crazy or the bravest guy I know," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Quincy gave a faint smile, but his hands still trembled. "Maybe a bit of both," he replied. They walked home, but Quincy couldn't shake the feeling that this day had changed something in him. And deep down, he knew the story wasn't over. The crowd had dispersed, but the shadows remained. Shadows of fear, anger, and misunderstanding, waiting for their moment to return. But alongside them, a spark of hope had emerged, fragile, but real. Quincy sat on the worn steps of his apartment building, holding a bottle of cold water. The sun was setting, painting the Brooklyn sky in shades of orange and purple. The street noise was fading, giving way to evening sounds. Distant laughter of kids riding bikes, the rhythmic chirping of cicadas, and muffled conversations of neighbors on their stoops. The air still held the day's heat, but a light breeze carried the smells of grilled meat from someone's kitchen and freshly cut grass. He twisted the bottle in his hands, feeling the cold condensation on his fingers. His thoughts kept returning to the scene on the street, to Randy's eyes, filled with a mix of anger and uncertainty, to the elderly woman's words that had cut through the tension like a knife. Quincy knew avoiding a fight was a victory, but it felt fragile, like glass ready to crack at the slightest blow. The building's door creaked, and Trevor stepped out onto the stairs, holding 2 cans of beer. His heavy footsteps echoed on the concrete, and a wide grin spread across his face when he saw Quincy, still out here plotting to save the world. Trevor teased, offering a can. Quincy smiled but shook his head, gesturing to his water. "I'm good with this for now," he said. "But thanks." Trevor shrugged and sat beside him, popping open a can. The cold, fizzy sound broke the silence, and Trevor took a long swig before speaking. "You know, I've been thinking about what you did all day," he said, his tone turning serious. "I wouldn't have held back in your place. One punch, and that Randy would have been flat on the asphalt." Quincy glanced at him, his eyebrows slightly raised. "And what would that have changed?" he asked quietly. "He'd just be more convinced we're what he thinks we are. I don't want to be his excuse." Trevor snorted, but respect flickered in his eyes. "You sound like my old man," he said. "He always said anger's a trap. But damn, Quincy, sometimes you just want to hit." "I know," Quincy replied, his voice almost a whisper. "Believe me, I felt it too." They fell silent, listening as the city settled into the evening. Quincy thought of his mom, probably cooking dinner in their old house across town. She always told him, "Words are your weapon, son. But they only work if you know where to aim." He wasn't sure if his words had hit the mark today, but at least they'd stopped the storm. Their conversation was interrupted by footsteps. Quincy looked up and saw a familiar figure emerging from the street's darkness. It was Randy, without his red cap, in a plain gray t-shirt. He looked less threatening, but his shoulders were still tense, his gaze wary. He held a small paper bag with the top of a beer bottle peeking out. Trevor instantly stiffened, his hand tightening around the can. Quincy placed a hand on his forearm, saying softly, "Easy." Randy stopped a few feet away, his eyes darting between Quincy and Trevor. He looked unsure, like he wasn't certain why he was there. "I'm not here for trouble," he said finally, his voice rough, as if the words were hard to get out. "Just wanted to talk." Quincy's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this. Not so soon, not after what happened. But he nodded, gesturing to the steps. "Sit," he said. "There's room." Randy hesitated, his fingers nervously clutching the bag. Finally, he stepped forward and sat on a lower step, keeping his distance. Trevor watched him closely, but stayed silent, giving Quincy space. Randy began, then stopped, searching for the right words. "What happened today? I didn't mean for it to go like that. Kyle, he gets worked up, and I just go along." Quincy nodded, his face calm, but inside he felt a mix of surprise and cautious hope. "Why'd you go along?" he asked, his voice gentle, without judgment. Randy sighed, his shoulders slumping. He pulled the beer bottle from the bag, but didn't open it, just turned it in his hands. "I grew up here," he said, "in this neighborhood. Things used to be different. You know, everyone knew each other, everyone was similar. Now everything's changing. New people, new faces. And I don't know how to deal with it." Quincy listened, feeling Randy's words echo his own memories. He remembered when his family moved to a new neighborhood, how neighbors looked at them with suspicion, how kids whispered behind his back. But instead of pointing that out, he asked, "And you think I'm part of those changes?" Randy looked at him, his eyes full of confusion. "I don't know," he admitted. Maybe I'm just mad, because everything I knew is slipping away. My dad lost his factory job when I was a teenager. Mom's barely scraping by now. And me. I just work construction and try not to think about it. But when I see someone like you, with your coffee and earbuds, I feel like you've got everything, and I've got nothing." Quincy felt something heavy settle in his chest. He could have told Randy about his student loans, the sleepless nights finishing projects, how his mom worked double shifts so he could go to college. But he realized Randy didn't need his stories. He needed someone to listen. "I get it," Quincy said. "Life hits everyone, doesn't it? But you know what I've learned? When we hit each other, it just makes everything worse." Randy nodded, his fingers tightening around the bottle. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly. "But Kyle and the others, they don't listen. They think you're just weak because you didn't fight." Trevor, who'd been silent until now, finally spoke, his voice low and firm. "Weak's the guy who fights because he can't think of anything better," he said. Quincy stopped what could have ended in blood today. "That's not weakness." Randy looked at Trevor, then back at Quincy. He opened his mouth to say something, but at that moment, noise erupted from the end of the street. Loud voices, footsteps, snatches of curses. Quincy's stomach tightened. He stood, peering into the darkness, and saw a familiar figure. Kyle, with the tattoo on his neck, was approaching, followed by 3 other men. Their voices were loud, aggressive, and one of them held a bottle that glinted in the light. "Well, look at this, Randy," Kyle called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "You hanging with them now?" Randy stood, his face darkening. Quincy saw his hands clench into fists and knew the moment of truth had arrived. He placed a hand on Randy's shoulder and said quietly, "You don't have to follow him. Not this time." Randy looked at him, his eyes full of doubt, but a spark flickered in them, fragile, but real. Quincy felt he was standing on the edge of a precipice, and what happened next would shape not just their fates, but something much bigger. The evening air grew heavy, as if a storm that never came was still lingering. Streetlights cast dim pools of light on the asphalt, stretching long shadows from the approaching figures. Kyle and his crew walked with confidence, their voices slicing through the quiet like blades. Quincy stood on the apartment building's steps, his hand still resting on Randy's shoulder, his heart pounding. Trevor stood, muscles tensed, but he didn't move, waiting for Quincy's cue. The smell of beer mingled with the evening damp and the distant aroma of fried food, creating an atmosphere teetering on the edge of chaos. Kyle stopped a few feet away, his neck tattoo seeming darker in the streetlight's glow. He looked at Randy, his lips curling into a mocking sneer. "What's this, Randy?" he taunted, his voice thick with contempt. "You one of them now? Decided to be their new buddy?" Randy stiffened, his fists clenching so tightly his knuckles whitened. Quincy felt his shoulder tremble under his hand and knew Randy was at a crossroads. One move, one word, and everything they'd tried to preserve would shatter like glass under a hammer. "Kyle, chill," Randy said, his voice rough but lacking the aggression it had before. "I just came to talk." Kyle laughed, but it was a sharp, unnatural sound. His friends, two guys in baseball caps, and one holding a bottle, exchanged glances, unsure how to react. The short, stocky one stepped forward. "Talk," he scoffed. "What, Randy? You singing in their choir now?" The group behind Kyle chuckled, but Quincy noticed their confidence waning. They expected Randy to join them, to fall back into their pack. But Randy didn't move. He stood, looking at Kyle, and in his eyes was something new, not anger, not fear, but something deeper, as if he was seeing himself from the outside for the first time. Quincy sensed this was his moment. He let go of Randy's shoulder and stepped forward, his hands relaxed, but his gaze steady. "Kyle," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You can follow your anger as long as you want. But where's it going to take you? A hospital? A jail cell? Or just another night, drinking to forget how bad things are?" Kyle blinked, his jaw tightening. He clearly hadn't expected Quincy to speak again, let alone with that tone, calm but piercing, as if he could see right through him. One of Kyle's friends, the one with the bottle, shifted nervously. "What are you even talking about?" Kyle snapped, but his voice wavered, as if he was trying to convince himself more than Quincy. "You think you can just talk, and we'll all walk away like good neighbors?" "I think you're smarter than that," Quincy replied, his eyes locked on Kyle's. "You can hit me, you can round up more guys, you can do whatever you want. But at the end of the day, you'll go home knowing nothing's changed. Your anger's not going anywhere. It'll just grow." Silence fell over the street, heavy as concrete. Even the cicadas seemed to hush. Kyle stood frozen, his chest heaving, his eyes darting between Quincy, Randy, and his friends. Quincy felt sweat trickle down his back, but he didn't look away. He knew Kyle was on the edge, between lashing out and backing down. Randy spoke first, his voice quiet but clear. "Kyle, he's right," he said. "I'm tired of this. The yelling, the fighting, all this crap. I don't want to be like this anymore." Kyle turned to him, his eyes flashing with anger. "You giving up?" he spat. "After everything we've been through? You're just gonna roll over and be their dog?" Randy shook his head, his face etched with exhaustion. "I'm not their dog," he said. "And I'm not yours. I just want to live, Kyle. Not fight every night. Not hate everyone around me. Just live." Those words, simple and honest, hit harder than any fist. Kyle stepped back, his face twisting, but he couldn't find a response. His friends stayed silent, their gazes wandering between the asphalt and the dark sky. The bottle in one of their hands slowly lowered. Quincy felt the tension ease, but he didn't relax. He knew moments like this were fragile, like the first ice on a lake. He looked at Kyle and said softly, "You can walk away now, Kyle. No one's gonna call it a loss. Just a choice." Kyle stood for another moment, his fists clenching and unclenching. Then he spat on the ground, his eyes still burning, but he turned to his friends. "Let's go," he muttered. "Nothing to talk about here." They walked off, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Quincy watched them go, feeling his heart finally slow. Randy stood beside him, his shoulders slumped, as if an invisible weight had been lifted. Trevor, who hadn't said a word, exhaled and shook his head. "I don't know how you do it," he said, his voice rough. "But damn, it worked." Quincy gave a faint smile, but his eyes stayed serious. "It's not over," he said, "but it's a start." Randy turned to him, his face a mix of shame and relief. "Thanks," he said quietly. I don't know what's next, but thanks." Quincy nodded, his hand resting on Randy's shoulder. "Just come by if you want to talk," he said. "Door's open." Randy nodded, his eyes glinting in the streetlight, and walked into the darkness, clutching his paper bag. Quincy and Trevor watched him disappear into the night's haze. They sat back on the steps, and Trevor opened the second beer, offering it to Quincy. This time, Quincy took it, taking a small sip. The cold bitterness spread across his tongue, and he felt his body finally relax. "You know," Trevor said, looking at the stars beginning to appear in the sky, "I thought you were crazy when you started talking. But maybe that's exactly what we need. More people like you." Quincy shook his head, his smile tired but genuine. "Not like me," he said. "Just people willing to listen and talk." They sat in silence, listening to the city breathe around them. Quincy knew tomorrow would bring new challenges. Kyle might come back, or someone else would take his place. But he also knew that today they'd done something important, not big, not loud, but real. One small step, one moment of understanding, one choice not to give in to anger. And that was enough to kindle a spark of hope in his heart. The city kept living its life. Somewhere a dog barked. Somewhere kids laughed. Somewhere a bus rumbled. And on the steps of an old Brooklyn building, two men sat and looked at the stars, knowing that even in the darkest night, you can find light if you take the first step.